Welcome to today's edition of the Tutte Seminar, obviously a very popular topic. I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker today, Dan Younger of the Department of Combinatorics and Optimization. Dan was my PhD supervisor a few years ago. Dan has had a long association with the university from the late 1960s. And before that, he worked in industry, in particular at General Electric, where he proved the characterization of regular languages, and is also very well known to people in combinatorial optimization and graph theory for the Lucchesi-Younger theorem. Dan has had many PhD students here and supervised many master's students, and has long been a very distinguished teacher. And it's my great pleasure to introduce my advisor and friend, Dan Younger, who will talk to us today about Bill Tutte, a snapshot of his life.
So on September 29th, I was looking through, trying to get rid of some papers in a box in my office, and I came upon this letter, which...
We're not supposed to hear it. It's for the camera.
Oh. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Yeah. Okay. This is the letter, and it was written June 7th, 1996. And so I thought it was an interesting letter, and I thought maybe it might be nice to share it with you. June 7th is one day after June 6th, and June 6th is the anniversary of D-Day, and that's partly related to this letter. And so 1996, Tutte was born in 1917, so he would be 79 at this time. And at this time, he was still under the requirements of the Official Secrets Act not to say anything about what happened during the war. And in this letter, you'll see he's invited to go back to Bletchley Park for the first time since the war. And this tells that story from his point of view. So you actually can see him entering again Bletchley Park. And so it's nice to follow not just the story, but also his own take on the story. And that's why I wanted to present this to you. So here's a picture of Bill a little earlier in 1987, so he would have been 70 at that time. You can see that it's graduation day, and he has just received an honorary doctorate from the university. And you can see that Dorothea is quite pleased at her husband and what has occurred. And he looks pretty pleased there himself. They lived out in West Montrose, a tiny village west of here, and this is the house they lived in. They lived in there from the time in 1962 when they moved to Waterloo. And it's on 2 acres of land, and it's right next to this bridge, the covered bridge, or sometimes called the Kissing Bridge, out there. And now we begin the letter, and this letter is, all of the letter will be demonstrated, and you can read it as we go along. And this is the beginning of the letter. Now, Bill's wife, Dorothea, she died in 1994, December 1994, and so this is a year and a half after that. And he has decided that the property's too big and that maybe he should go back to England. And so he goes back, and this is written from his niece Jeanne's place, where he's been given a room. in Newmarket, England. Now, Newmarket's about 10 miles from Cambridge, east of Cambridge, and Cambridge is about 60 miles from London. He was, as I say, born there. And this also is the place which now has made a memorial in his honor. And so I will, at the end, show you some pictures from that unveiling in Newmarket. So, as he says, he's been there about a month. And he says he feels settled. Actually, to jump ahead a little bit, 3 years later, he will come back to Waterloo and spend the rest of his time here. This is Jeanne, his niece, whom he's living with. She is the daughter of his older brother. His brother, Joseph, was 16 years older than he, and so she is only 15 years younger than Bill. And there was a very close relationship between them all their lives. And when he was at university, he'd come home for the weekend, and she would find him just an absolute fount of knowledge and really enjoyed the relationship. And that was mutual, and it was true throughout their lives. And that's why he felt comfortable in going back there to live with Jeanne. This is Newmarket, the clock tower that's in the center of the town. And, but here's a more typical scene. It's horse country. In the background is Newmarket, and all around Newmarket there's horse training facilities. And this is historic. Newmarket was the very first place in which horse racing took place, according to Google, back in the 1100s. But it became a center of horse racing when the kings, starting with King James in the early 1600s, decided to go out there, and King James built a palace in Newmarket. And so, the very first day in our visit in September that we got there, we were taken out to see a stable. And this particular stables is owned by Sheikh Mohammed, the ruler of Dubai. It's just an absolutely fabulous place. I'll tell a story that I was going to leave out that, well, incidentally, I mean, I stand next to the horse, and what does he do? He bites me in the shoulder and until he gets a swat from Hugh Anderson, who thinks it's funny, you see. But anyway, but just to digress even over this digression, why this stable was built in 1903 by Frederick Stanley, the 16th Earl of Derby, and Stanley was earlier a Governor General of Canada, and in that role, his children got interested in hockey, and he donated the Stanley Cup, which is now the most important, I guess, symbol of Canadian sporting life. So I'm just recovering from this rather rude shock that I have there. But this happens the very first day I'm in Newmarket. They have to take me to the horses. But actually, Bill himself was born at a horse stable, Fitzroy House, and the main place of that, and his father was the gardener there, and his mother the housekeeper. Here is the center of town, very close, just within a block of that clock tower. And here is where the monument to Tutte is. Well, it's actually already there. But, and on the left of this is you'll see it in some other pictures, is a place which once held gardens, and his father was the gardener right in that garden that was right next to the Rutland Arms Hotel. He was the gardener and supplied the vegetables and flowers for the table for this hotel. So they picked a very good place to form their monument. Unbeknownst, though, they didn't know that. Here, actually, you can see that T.K. Maxx Place is the place where it actually had been used at the time that people would drive their horse carriages through that through that archway to the entrance. You can just see the entrance there, and then park their horses over at T.K. Maxx's when it was that. But the garden was developed in that area, just for your... But I'm digressing a bit. Let's get back to the letter. Oh, well, let me still digress a little more, if I may. So I want to tell a little bit about Tutte's early life. The family, rather soon, when he was still a baby, probably because this was 1917, 1918, it was the end of the war, things were unstable, so they actually couldn't keep this position. They moved to another place, Englewood Green, which was on the other side of London, and then up to Durham, further north, and finally up to Yorkshire, to a lovely place called Moor End. And that's a place which Tutte remembered rather nostalgically. And then, when he was about 7 years old, they came back to Newmarket. Well, not quite Newmarket, to Cheveley, a little tiny village which is just 3 miles east of Newmarket. But that's why his father worked in town at the hotel, but this is where he lived. And this is about the only street in town called High Street. There's no commercial establishments at all. And and up this way, you come to, well, first this is looking back the other way along High Street. And then if you walk up this direction, there's the house that he grew up in. Actually, this sloping roof, the room under that wasn't there at the time. And actually, it was 2 attached houses, and they lived in the rear half of this attached pair. But that's his boyhood home, looking in rather good shape now. This is the idea of the way that house is. It's 2 houses put together, perhaps of exactly the same design, except for their house, they had a facing of flint rock rather than brick, as here. And here is Cheveley School, as it stands today. And here is the schoolroom inside. There was, which was a shock to me, just one room for the students there at that time. So it was basically a one-room schoolhouse. And this is the room. And this is what you see when you look out from that room. And here is another look at the school where you're inside the fence rather than on the outside. Basically the same picture. And here's another picture. Actually, here you're on the outside again, and except for that, you see that it's the same. I mean, the angle is a little different because this is taken close, the picture is closer, so you don't really see as much of the right-hand end, but the school hasn't really changed at all. And there he is. I guess it's probably in about his first year there.
Which one was
What? The pink arrow.
it? Oh, oh.
So let's get back to the letter. And here he describes this as a rather active month, that he made 2 trips to see Cedric Smith. Now, Cedric Smith was one of his friends from his undergraduate days at Trinity College. Cedric was the one who was most active in keeping them all sort of together. But they all met each other as much as they could. Now, by this time, well, let me just go on a little further. So he goes to see Cedric at the Galton Laboratory. This was his second visit since he got there. And you can see that Cedric has had some operation. I think it was a hip operation that makes it difficult for him to walk now. This is University College London, which the Galton Laboratory is associated with, and in the letter it was saying it took him, he was a half kilometer away and had to walk there to get here. And here are the 4. These are 4 who met at Trinity College in their first year. The other 3 were mathematics majors, and Bill was a major in chemistry at that time. And they had a friendship which lasted all of their lives. For Arthur Stone became a topologist and married another mathematician, and they had 2 little mathematicians and so forth. Cedric Smith, he became a professor of biostatistics at the Galton Laboratory of UCL. And here's Brooks, who is the hardest to find a picture of. I couldn't find one, so I just had to cut out the picture from the, well, I haven't shown where I cut it from, but, and he became a tax inspector. The others, but he is well known to graph theorists, Brooks's theorem. And so these 4 worked as an undergraduate. Actually, Tutte was getting a first-class honors in chemistry while he was spending most of his days working on mathematics. But this is the 4 of them. And here's a picture of them. And if you're getting used to these pink arrows, you can find them. I had to cut this picture out because I couldn't find any picture of. There do exist them, but I not online. And here you can see today where that picture was taken. Right there. This is in the forecourt of Trinity College. And one of the things which they were working on was trying to study the question of whether it was possible to break a square into smaller squares, all of which were unequal. And this is the smallest such square which is known to this day. This is not one which they found, but it is one which is commemorated on the memorial site. You can see it's exactly the same square. This appears, oops, sorry, yeah, on the memorial site. It's a bit of a selfie. This is my daughter. So continuing with the letter, I judged the meeting at Reading a great success. So there was a combinatorial meeting there, which had Paul Erdös and many other famous mathematicians. And he gave a talk, which was, I guess he doesn't really mention yet what his talk is about, but it was about dividing an equilateral triangle into smaller equilateral triangles. And he also was asked to give a speech in honor of Crispin Nash-Williams. And apparently he did an okay job. This is the University of Reading. And here's a picture of Paul Erdös and Crispin Nash-Williams. Now I should say, particularly for those who weren't here in the early days, that Crispin was one of the founding members of the C&O department. He played a tremendous role in the early development of the department. He was the graduate officer. He made rigorous, comprehensive exams for graduate students. And he was also a fearsome thesis examiner. One of his advisees was Václav Havel. He certainly, but he was good not only with the strongest students, but also weak students. He was good at taking them and giving them lessons and tutorials that brought them up to meet this standard that was required by his comprehensive exams. And he played a tremendous role in the development of the early department. He left after 5 years and went back to the University of Aberdeen. And then eventually, when Richard Rado died, he took the chair at Reading, and that was why this particular meeting commemorates his retirement there. And but yes, he was a very important figure in the early department. One of my students referred to him as Smash Williams, which was actually meant very approvingly, meaning that was his way of attacking combinatorial problems. But another of my students, Claudio Lucchesi, why he was very proud of his thesis and wanted the most rigorous examination possible, so he wanted Nash-Williams to be his external examiner. But he had a reputation as being rigorous. And not only that, but Paul Seymour and others can tell you how rigorous a job he did in examining papers. So undoubtedly, Tutte had a lot of good things to say about Nash-Williams at that time. So here he explained that he had much to say about Kirchhoff's laws, that is, the laws about electrical networks. And so Bela Bolabash, who's professor at Trinity College, he invited him to give a talk at Cambridge. And these laws apparently were an extension of the ordinary Kirchhoff laws, and that they seemed, as he said, to be interested in that work. And so here's a picture of Bela. And here is the front entrance to Trinity College. You can see Henry VIII sitting there in his glory, standing there. And here is the photographer for most of these pictures, my daughter Meredith, but not this one. And here's the forecourt of Trinity College. This is Actually, it's amazing how small Trinity College is. It's just this square, and then another one behind it, which is smaller, and then just another side such court. And that's all it is, and yet it's such a famous place for learning. It's actually a very wonderful atmosphere in there. There's a lot of bustle of Cambridge on the outside, but once one gets inside, it's all gone. It's a lovely place. Here's the Neville's court, where Tutte was had his residence when he was a graduate student. An undergraduate, he was in the front court, but as a graduate student, it was here in Neville's court. And one of the most famous parts of Trinity College is the Wren Library. Christopher Wren was the architect of this library. It's just exquisite. One is just struck by the beauty of the place. Actually, during, again, a little digression, but during the early part of the war, when Tutte was still a student at Trinity College, he would spend some of his evenings as a fire warden on the roofs of these buildings around this court. And Cedric painted the roof of Wren College gray in order to try to make it less visible from the air. That was his first job, and then Cedric became a hospital porter. Cedric was a Quaker, and so therefore refused military service, and so he, after that, became a hospital porter, and that continued even long after the war. They didn't want to make it particularly easy to opt out of the war. And this is still in back of that Neville's court is the so-called the backs, and here is the river Cam, over which there's been a bridge for a long time. And while we are in Cambridge, we go out to the outskirts and we see this building, and this is where Tutte went to high school. At that time, it was the Cambridge and County High School for boys, and now it's Hills Road Sixth Form College. But there it is. Okay, so let's get back to our main story. About a couple of weeks ago, Jeanne got a phone call from Tony Sale of Bletchley Park asking if she had any idea where he was at the moment, to which she replied, "He's sitting beside me." This is Tutte, of course. Typical Tutte. Of course, the reason was, of course, that Tony Sale hadn't heard that he wasn't still in Canada. This was a surprise, and his message was that Colossus had been rebuilt and that there was going to be a ceremony at Bletchley Park, and he invited Bill to come along. And then the machine would then be switched on by the Duke of Kent. And so he's supposed to come over to the ceremony. So Richard is Jeanne's son, Richard Youlden. He took Bill to Bletchley. Bletchley was over halfway between Oxford and Cambridge. And you can see that he couldn't remember how to get there after 50 years. And unfortunately, apparently other veterans had the same problem, and the ceremony was delayed. But anyway, this is it. Here is a picture of Richard Youlden as he is today. And this is in the front court there of Trinity, and he's standing behind him is Howard Cadman, who was very helpful in hosting parts of our trip there. So he joins the group of veterans, and the Duke comes in and shakes hands, and Tony introduces me as he who broke the Tunny key. Now you have to remember that Tutte's not allowed to say anything. Of course, Tony's a little bit more, Tony has a reason for trying to change the situation, because Tony has built the Colossus, rebuilt the Colossus. He had trouble getting permission to do so, but he had gotten permission to do so. But the problem that he faced, Tony, was that he has a Colossus, and he's not supposed to say what Colossus is used for. So Tony has a lot of motivation to try to break that, that situation. So Tony introduced me as he who broke the Tunny key. And so His Royal Highness replies, that was by hand methods, I suppose. And so Tutte says something that nobody could object to. He says, I agreed. And then he adds a little more, which is ultra modest, of course. I just happened to write it out on the right period, said I. And Tony opined that it wasn't quite that simple, and they passed on. And then he gathered for the ceremony, and there were speeches, and Colossus was officially turned on. It was a year later that Tony Sale had an interview with the new scientist, and that story came out on Tutte's 80th birthday, and that explains exactly what happened and what the relation of Tutte's work and Colossus was. And so I don't know whether in the intervening period between this ceremony and the next year, whether there was some understanding that this was going to be done or not. It's not part of what I understand, but it was a year later that the story broke. And this is not a very good picture, but I thought it would be worth including, because it shows his HRH pushing the button. And here's Tommy Flowers, the person who had built the original Colossus. And Tony Sale. And here, the same day, is a slightly better picture of Tony Sale and Bill Tutte. This is the day in which he's writing about in the letter. And I guess Tutte is a little amused, or quite a little, anyway, but you can see his. And there's the person is a reporter, I believe, between them, but that's right at that moment. Okay, so now I'm going to tell you a little bit about Bletchley Park, which they were visiting. Here's a nice picture of the mansion on Bletchley Park from the distance. And you can see a gray heron in the middle of the lake. And it's and here's the mansion up close. By and large, most of the exhibits are actually in this mansion, most of the main exhibits. But the Colossus is somewhere far away, and there's a bit of dispute between those who are dealing with the Colossus and those who are part of the Bletchley Park Trust. But, and here's a picture which I never saw before of Bill Tutte from that time. The spots are due to glare from the plastic which is covering it, but that's what Bill Tutte looked like when he entered, or in the early years at Bletchley. When he arrived at Bletchley, he was first given a Hagelin machine, a machine which was developed by the Swedish and was used for field communications, not a particularly high level of cipher machine, just intended for temporary security. And Tutte worked on that and showed how to break it after about 3 months. And so then, having done that, why, he was moved on to the Lorenz machine, the Tunny machine. This is, of course, a modern picture. There was no Tunny machine there. I mean, they had a teletype output which was coming, which they could hardly even figure out because it was coming in at high speed, and what it was just a mystery. And Tutte, as he said, was lucky to figure out what the number of spokes on all of those wheels from a sample of tape, which was 4,000 bits long, not bits, but 400 positions long, 4,000 positions long. And from that, they were able to figure out what the machine was. But of course, actually, just because you know what a machine was, they knew what the Hagelin machine was beforehand. They knew what the Enigma was beforehand. But then there's still the question of what do you do when somebody makes ciphers on this? And so Tutte's really intellectual, tremendous contribution was to give a method, so-called statistical method. I don't know whether he was helped by his friend Cedric in this, but for breaking codes that ciphers that were on the Lorenz machine. Here tries to show the rotors more impressively, all of them. But oops, sorry. Oh, sorry. Oh dear. Oh, sorry. Oops. So we looked into the museum. He's now referring to the museum that was at the mansion. And he says it was to him more of a war museum than a cryptographic one. Perhaps that will change with time. I saw it recently, and I think that probably his assessment is still valid. And then we trekked across to where Colossus abode, and Richard had trouble with the steps, but with help they were surmounted. It was a very hot day. Outside there was some breeze, but none Chez Colossus. He took a photograph of me. Maybe it was that photograph or perhaps some other one, but and eventually they went back to the mansion. They enjoyed a buffet lunch, went back to the car, and he had trouble being nice to all of the veterans who recognized him there. And then he says, since then there's been nothing comparable to report. Again, a bit of Tutte. And that's the letter. Here's where the Colossus lives and is located. And you can see that on a hot day, it would be hot there. And I think this is actually, maybe it's been polished up a little, but not too much, where Colossus was in the war. At least that's my understanding. And there's a picture of the Colossus machine. There's another picture of Bill. Later on in the war, he fashioned a mustache. And that's a picture of him.
Yeah.
Well, that's the letter. I now will make a few remarks about the ceremony that was held in Newmarket, which is a memorial to Tutte. So it's held right there at the Rutland Arms Hotel, and this, where this store is, was where the horse garage used to be, and where Tutte's father's garden was. But here's a wheel that's put on the ground, and you can imagine how many spokes it has in it, 41, the number of spokes that was in the first wheel that he determined of the rotor. And there's a message around there which says that this was one of the greatest intellectual feats of World War II. So this is before the ceremony begins. The children of All Saints Primary School, our choir, are gathered to sing, and the actual representation of Tutte is behind these flags on the left. On the right, there's an information board which has Tutte and some facts about him, and on the back is a list of major contributors, including the University of Waterloo mathematics faculty. And you can find, if you have a mobile device, you can find out various information about Tutte by going to each of those boxes and putting it in. And here's a picture from further out. You see that there's a crowd that's gathered along High Street. And the children, I think, now are singing. Once the ceremony starts, the first thing they sing is "O Canada." And actually, they were very generous in acknowledging him as Canadian. And here, again, is a slightly different picture. They may have gotten to "God Save the Queen" at this point, because they don't have any, their music has been put on the ground. But, and here's the picture of the honored guests, which are about to come out. Those guests included Mai Roberts, the widow of Jerry Roberts, who was had publicized Tutte's work, and the mayor and everyone involved. Kenneth Flowers, the son of Tommy Flowers, was there, and many people. They invited quite a wonderful group of people. And here these guests are entering for the ceremony. Speeches by the mayor and the local rectors, etc. And here, now the ceremony is over, and the Rachel Wood, a wonderful local school teacher, is telling them about the squaring the square. And you see a few of them have kept their Canadian flags, which were more in evidence in the when they were singing "O Canada." Here is later, the ceremony is over, and if you look carefully, you can you see the image of Tutte over in the left side? It actually depends a lot on exactly where you're standing, and also it's affected a little bit by the lighting in the rear. So there are better angles. I don't know that this is a particularly good angle, but this gives you an idea that these are panels with holes on it. They're supposed to be reminiscent of a teletype tape, but together they form a pattern, and supposedly the best place to stand is right on top of the of the squared square. So this wouldn't be quite the best place because you see the squared square here, but you can still see an image of Bill. And that's what I wanted to say.
Could you comment on the Children's Math Society?
Oh, yes, yes.
If you could just hang on 1 second so you can ask the question again, please.
Would you comment on the Children's Math Society there, please?
Yes. The same Rachel Wood has organized a monthly session for the children of Newmarket, which is called the Bill Tutte Maths Club. And after this ceremony, a little later in the afternoon, I was invited to go speak with them, and I had a wonderful experience with them. I have some very nice pictures of that, but I haven't brought them with me today, unfortunately. But it's very nice, and each month they have some rather wonderful speakers. I'm not trying to talk about when I was there, but anyway, but she's done a very nice job, and the children are quite enthusiastic. It's some of the loveliest pictures are the pictures of the children who are quite enthusiastic. One of the things, when I was there, I had given them a whole sequence of puzzles to work on, which were map coloring problems, but and extensions of them, like the threefold problem. But the children, I think, did better than the adults in actually dealing with these problems, by and large. I mean, the children varied a lot in their capabilities, but as a class, I think they did better than their seniors.
Thank
Are there any other questions?
Did Bill discuss his Bletchley Park days after he came back to Waterloo from England? When he came back, did you or Murthy have any conversations where Bill actually talked about the Bletchley Park days?
Well, a year later, he came back for the 80th birthday conference. And at that time was when the story broke. It was just during that meeting. So I would say, except for acknowledging that it was public now, why nothing was spoken of really at that time. But then he came back a year later for 2 months instead of 1 month, and then a year later, and he came back permanently, shall we say. So, and then he wrote an article. The first article that he wrote was called Fish and I, about his experiences. But there were two problems with that article. One was that the editing of it had made sort of a muddle of it, and he has C's and Phi's, and they mixed up where half the time when it's a C, it's supposed to be a Phi, and because of that, he was very unhappy with that and was never given the proofs to see before it came out. And meanwhile, he also started remembering more things, and so it was in 2001, just a year before he died, that he wrote a more comprehensive and rather beautiful account called At Bletchley Park. And so in that period, why a number of us, he would then talk about his war experience.
Any last question?
Well, thank you.
Comment, the photos were remarkably good.
Yeah, that's, I have to,
Is there a close-up picture of Tutte statue? I mean,
well, I mean, a close-up picture of it isn't a good thing because all you see is those holes, shall we say. I mean, you have to be standing back in order to actually get an appreciation. There are somewhat better pictures than either of the ones I showed here. All of these, I don't want to make an ad for it, but all of these were taken on Meredith's iPhone.
Thank you very much, Dan.